I'd like to welcome Dr. Patrick Keyzer, who is a lawyer and an academic specialising in access to justice, constitutional law and human rights. And Patrick's going to talk about why hasn't decriminalisation and legalisation of adult recreational cannabis use happened in Australia yet, when most US states have taken steps in this direction. And I must say, though, of course, there has been a little bit of work in Canberra, like the mythical zone known as the ACT, where strange liberal drug laws seem to happen, but they don't happen anywhere else in Australia. So thank you very much, Patrick. Over to you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Perhaps it's one rule for the federal politicians who spend most of their time in the ACT and one rule for everyone else. Thank you for the warm welcome. Firstly, let me also acknowledge that we're on Bundjalung land, the Bible and Widjabul people, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I just thought I'd take the opportunity initially, thank you so much, to just make a couple of quick comments about some of the talks we've had this morning and just my reflections on them. Firstly, it's good to see Steve Bolt again. Steve's a reminder that one of the few benefits of getting older as a lawyer is you have more and more wisdom because you've seen more and more case studies. So his advice to you was don't speak and get a lawyer. And that's excellent advice. You don't know what you don't know. So it's really important to get legal advice if you're ever in a position where you've been being investigated or charged with a crime. It was also good to see David Shoebridge, who I've only ever seen over Zoom. It's rare to find a politician who has such a sophisticated understanding of how the criminal justice system actually operates. And so I think that's really a great thing. And I know that there are other political parties that also have people involved in them who have that understanding of the criminal justice system and how it actually operates. Michael White gave a characteristically brilliant talk. Do get on his listserv if you want regular doses of information. As Kathleen correctly observed, this community is really fortunate to have someone like Michael White in its corner because he's someone who takes science very seriously, and as the son of a chemistry professor, I really like that. I warmly welcome that. He was talking about human rights at the end of his talk. You may not have been aware that Australia is a signatory to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and Article 15(1)(b) of that covenant gives us the benefit, gives us the human right to the benefits of scientific progress. Now, the only thing that's standing in between us and having that human right are politicians. So it's interesting. We talk about human rights in Australia, and I might just touch on that issue for a moment. Australia is actually a signatory to most of the major international human rights covenants, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which contains the prohibition, I should say, against arbitrary arrest and arbitrary detention, and Michael was reflecting on those in his talk. So they're our human rights. They're the human rights of everyone in this room. And the only reason why we don't have them in Australia is because our politicians have not implemented those treaties into domestic law. And they have the legislative power to do that. And they've had the legislative power to do that since the Tasmanian Dams case in 1983. So we have human rights, they're our human rights, but our governments are not implementing them. So you really need to think in all of your engagement on political matters, think about those politicians who are going to implement your human rights into domestic law with judicially enforceable remedies. I'm writing a book at the moment that's exploring Australia's human rights record. And we have, organisations like the Australian Human Rights Commission. And people think, oh, well, my human rights are protected. I can go to the New South Wales Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, or I can go to the Australian Human Rights Commission and I can make a complaint. You cannot get a judicially enforced remedy from those commissions. They're not courts. And yet, if you go to a court and you argue for human rights, you'll find that those courts have been stripped of the jurisdiction to give you human rights remedies. So we have a situation in Australia where we have human rights commissions that can't provide enforceable remedies, and then we have courts that have no jurisdiction over human rights. It's the worst of all worlds. And it's a small reason that people make complaints to the United Nations Human Rights Committee about Australia's performance under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But what I've learned after reading the 550,000 words of decisions over the last 30 odd years, looking at about 150 UN communications from Australians to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, is that the Australian government, after the United Nations Human Rights Committee says, well, you've violated human rights, Australia, you have to fix this, Australia never does. So out of 150 decisions, it's only complied with 3 of them. And it hasn't complied with any decision since 1997. Now, the only thing that's separating us from the human rights that are ours is politicians. So it's something to think about. So I'm going to talk about my special topic, which is the United States. And let me firstly acknowledge also the Barkinji people, whose elders very kindly allowed Reparation Legal, the law firm that I'm involved in, to use the expression Withu Gurpa in our logo. That's Barkinji language for sit, listen, reflect. It doesn't have an exact translation in English, but that's the closest translation. And that's what we try and do at Reparation Legal. So just a little bit about me. I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for about 30 years. I mainly work in constitutional law, public policy advice and the like. The first bullet point and the last bullet point are the important ones. I grew up in California. I lived in the United States for 11 years and all throughout high school. So I have a strong familiarity with the topics I'm about to talk about. And most recently, in the last few bullet points, some recent writing I've done. If you type my unusually spelt surname into Google, you'll find my publications. And I'd like to thank and acknowledge Jeremy Buckingham, who encouraged me to write about the Constitution and cannabis oil, where I learned that Queen Victoria's doctor used to prescribe her cannabis oil for menstrual cramps. There's an article about it in The Lancet in, I think, 1896, for those of you who are interested. Oop. Not moving from this slide for some reason. Space bar inactive. Let's do it this way. All right. So what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the US Constitution. I'm going to talk about the Australian Constitution. I'm going to talk about the key similarities and the key differences, and why those constitutional differences really matter. And also why we should consider, as a public policy set of developments, decriminalising first and then legalising. And the reason behind that is really about tax and revenue, and I'll explain how that's going to operate. And how could legalisation play out? And then I'll take questions and answers. So let me make some general comments about the American Constitution and the Australian Constitution. But firstly, some general observations about the US, how they're different to us. The United States sees itself and its citizens see themselves as living in a rights-based political culture. So Americans are always conscious of their rights. It's important that we understand, though, that that's not human rights. If you read human rights instruments like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, they are very different. to the Bill of Rights in the US Constitution. And it's also important in describing US as a rights-based culture that you don't think believe that it's a culture of civil rights, because it really isn't. You only have to consider how strenuously Republican governments in particular try to suppress the vote to know that it's not a civil rights culture at all. It's really a rights culture that suits white, male, rich people. And at the moment, it's what you call a kakistocracy, which I had to look up, and it's a word that means government by the worst people, or government by the least qualified. And that's what we've got in the United States at the moment, and unfortunately everybody's suffering as a result. So cannabis was legalised in the United States for a large number of reasons, and we're going to talk about states' rights in a minute, because it really is a country that's made up of 50 different countries. States' rights are a thing in the United States in a way that they really aren't in Australia. And it's also a country that has a lot of people with libertarian tendencies. They believe in small government and government that isn't going to regulate their personal choices. There's certainly been a measure of interest in the criminal justice savings that governments can have at the state level over there if they stop enforcing cannabis possession, small level cultivation and so on and so forth. But really, if you're looking for a single factor or concept that drives how legislation and regulation operates in the United States, it's money. It's really all about money. And some of you who are interested in American politics would have heard of the political observer Anthony Scaramucci, who's managed to leverage a 1-week stint as Trump's press secretary into an entire podcasting career. He's co-host of a politics podcast called The Rest is Politics. And Scaramucci is an investor, and he's known for saying that Wall Street is colourblind, except when it comes to green. So really, green, but we're talking greenbacks, cash, is the reason why American governments do things. And this is also the reason why the cannabis industry in that country, even if at a state-by-state level, it starts as a cottage industry with modest surroundings and well-meaning people who are sharing medicines with each other and so on and so forth, can quickly become an industry that goes from boutique to franchised. And you only have to travel, you don't have to travel in the United States to understand the power of franchising in that country, because we are surrounded in Australia by the Golden Arches. So they export their franchising all over the world. It's this homogenisation and the movement away from boutique, small level cultivation to mass market, mass production, massification of any industry really in the United States, and guarding against that in a legalised cannabis market is a significant thing. So for America, I might move on to the next slide. I might move on to this slide and talk about some of these materials and just add a little bit to these slides. The key similarities between our countries, prisons that are bursting at the seams. If the Northern Territory was a country, it would have the second most number, in terms of a percentage, of incarcerated people on earth after El Salvador. So we have a heavily incarcerated country. And this is a trend that's been happening for some decades now, and it is not assisted by state governments that have engaged in bail reforms recently in the Northern Territory, Queensland, and soon in Victoria, that are designed to keep people in prison, keep people on remand, and so on and so forth. So criminal justice systems are expensive, they do damage to people. It's not the way that cannabis use, possession, and small level cultivation at home should be addressed. But unfortunately, it is. So one of the levers for thinking about how to change the minds of governments is to think about how we can persuade them that the expense of criminal justice systems is deeply problematic. And I was pleased to hear Senator Shoebridge say this morning, he mentioned the statistic of 60,000 possession arrests. It's actually more than 70,000 possession arrests each year in this country. And you just think of how many hundreds of millions of dollars are wasted in police time, but it's all the back office work. They have to go back to the police station, they have to spend time typing up the paperwork, then it goes off to lawyers, it goes off to the courts, it wastes people's time. There are hundreds of millions of dollars of wasted resource spent on cannabis possession and use offences in this country. And as Senator Shoebridge very correctly advised, it's the net widening effects. So he used the example of, police go to a house for a family violence call, and the next thing you know, they're pinging someone for having a plant in their backyard. So it's the net widening effect of the criminal justice system that's problematic. And also, Dr. White, just a few moments ago, you see this net widening in other areas. So initially, drug offences, RDT is justified on the basis of stopping people with impairment from driving, and then it becomes presence in your blood, which could have nothing to do with impairment, as Dr. White mentions. It's the net widening effect, and we really need to guard against that. And it's the politicians, ultimately, who we need to be talking to about this. So it's when you have politicians who have that understanding, it's a really good thing. We both have regressive tax systems, okay? So what that means is people who bear taxes in this country and also in their country are us, just ordinary people. We pay the goods and services tax, we pay the income tax, but who isn't paying the tax? Mining isn't taxed, right? And housing investors get a tax break, and people with large superannuation balances get a tax break, okay? So you need to think about who is being taxed and how in your country, and that becomes an important kernel for a conclusion I'm going to reach in a moment about how I think the tax debate might affect legalisation in this country. Recognition of the medicinal qualities of cannabis is a key similarity now, but it wasn't 20 years ago. It's really the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s that we have to thank for the growth in the science of cannabis over the last 10 to 20 years in particular. So those people who are the leaders of the movement, and Michael Balderston and all the people here, thank you for your warm welcome to me. This is my first MardiGrass. I really appreciate it. And I have to say, Michael is a significant figure, as you all know. The people who've been running MardiGrass for years here, that counterculture movement here in Nimbin has created an environment for academics and researchers to walk into the studying medicinal cannabis and finding that there's wonderful things you can do with medicinal cannabis. So we owe a lot to that earlier generation of countercultural activists who've placed us in a position now where we have medicinal cannabis throughout Australia since 2016, and we can start to think of the next steps. Interestingly, both countries are signatories to the single convention on narcotic drugs, called the Single Convention because it brought together a number of basically anti-drug treaties that were proselytised mainly by the US during the course of the mid-20th century, which were designed to create a number of satellite countries, including Australia, because Australia has historically and traditionally been a satellite of the United States, that drugs are evil. And in fact, the opening language of the Single Convention says that drugs are evil, that illicit use of drugs is evil. So it was really, the single convention is really a moral panic in international legalese. And that's why countries like Canada in particular, which as you know has legalised cannabis, have stepped away from the single convention and said, you know what, if you want to regulate cannabis, and have a safe, healthy, science-driven market of legalised cannabis, you need to ignore the single convention, or at least interpret it really, really narrowly. And it may interest you to learn that it's a principle of Australian constitutional law that when Australia signs a treaty, it can choose to implement all of it or only part of it. And but when it comes to human rights, they've implemented none of it. So just keep that in mind. Always keep in mind that your politicians at the state and federal level have not implemented your human rights into domestic law. And that's the big awakening that I think we need to have in this country. Finally, the key similarity of federalism. It leads to regulatory anomalies, right? So in the United States, banking has been regulated at the federal level, and so that meant that when the states legalised cannabis over there, they couldn't access banking. So it was difficult to, it made it a hassle for dispensaries. They had to use cash. They couldn't rely on the safety and security of federal banks. For a long time, you couldn't, tap your card to buy something at a dispensary and so on and so forth. Now that's starting to be pulled apart in different innovative ways. I don't have time to go through it all. But another key difference of the similarity, which I want to focus on more in a minute, is the sales tax differences. So you're all aware of the GST. It's a national sales tax in Australia of 10%. In the United States, sales taxes are done at the state level. And that is absolutely critical, and a critical reason why we haven't had, in my opinion, legalisation yet in Australia. The key differences are our federalism is very different, right? Because in Australia, the states can't impose a sales tax, right? So they can only the national government can impose a sales tax. States can't do it. Now, that's the critical problem here, because the states have got the power to decriminalise cannabis, the states have got the power to legalise cannabis, but they don't have the power to tax sales of cannabis. So why would you, just thinking from the perspective of a state politician, from one or both of the major parties, why would you legalise it if you can't tax it, right? That's the fundamental disconnect. So what we're going to have in Australia, if we want to have a taxed, legalised cannabis system in Australia, is you're going to need federal and state and territory cooperation. Now, we all know how hard that is. It's incredibly difficult. Can be done though, but it's incredibly difficult. So that's an important point. Australian Parliament has the power to regulate plant variety rights. That's the difference. They do have plant patents in the United States, so there is a little bit of similarity there, but there's some differences that I won't go into. Australia has implemented the single convention into federal criminal law, and picking up on the last point, and Senator Shoebridge also made this point, in Australia, Commonwealth law, federal law, overrides state law to the extent of its inconsistency, which is another reason why you need federal cooperation for effective cannabis legalisation in Australia, because let's just say that the Victorian government decides to legalise cannabis. They might do that, but if a political party of a different colour takes charge in Canberra and they don't like that Victoria has legalised cannabis, they could pass legislation implementing the single convention against narcotics into domestic law, and that would have the effect of overriding the state law to the extent of its inconsistency. So it's like whack-a-mole. Basically, the Commonwealth government, anytime the states or territories do something that they don't like, the Commonwealth government can whack-a-mole. And we saw that when the ACT tried to introduce same-sex marriage about 10 years ago. whack, the Howard government knocked it on the head. We saw that about 20 years ago when the Northern Territory government tried to have voluntary assisted dying, and the federal government knocked it on the head, right? So we need consensus. We need consensus of the state and federal governments in Australia if you want to have effective legalisation. And that's really the point that I've anticipated this slide. So the states or territories can decriminalise, they can legalise, but they can't tax sales, so that revenue incentive is gone. And the other problem you can have, you see a bit of this in the United States, you see governments taking a step forward and then taking half a step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And there's always the risk that the Commonwealth government will come along and change everything. That's why I think it's all about the revenue. So I just want to talk about the revenue aspect just a little while longer. I've got 2 more slides. And why I think that a decriminalisation and then a legalisation approach, it makes sense. And why I think it's about revenue. So this morning, Senator Shoebridge was saying, why don't we have a legalised cannabis market and have taxes on cannabis, and then that tax can be used and can be hypothecated to health services, for example, or other civil services. And that's a very sensible approach to regulation. The one thing you have to be mindful of, though, is if the taxes are too high, then that means people will be, instead of buying the legal cannabis, they might be drawn to black market cannabis that they don't know, and they don't know what's in it, right? So how do you address that? Well, I think you address that by having decriminalisation first. Because if you allow people to grow their own and you fix the problem with the ACT legislation, which is seeds are still illegal in the ACT. It's a bizarre system. If you live in the ACT, you can grow 4 plants in your backyard, but you're not allowed to trade seeds with people. Which is odd. I mean, where does it come from? So decriminalisation, where people can grow homegrown, say 6 plants, which is the Victorian model that's been introduced recently by David Eddershank and Rachel Payne, where you can grow 6 plants, where people can trade seeds, where you can gift small amounts, small possession offences removed, no more 70,000 arrests each year. This sort of approach makes sense because if you start with decriminalisation, then a lot of people who use cannabis regularly will be able to get the cannabis they need. They'll be able to learn about seeds and plants. They'll become horticulturalists. They'll learn about the medicine. They'll learn about the recreational use that they want. And that means that the scope for a legalised market is thereby shrunk, right? And then the legal market's only going to work if the people who are operating in that market are providing a product or a service that is a value add on what you can do at home. And that way I think you'd get a nice balance between a decriminalised market and a legalised market. And these are all the reasons why I've formed that conclusion. At the moment, there's no revenue for the health system under the current model. And if you have revenue from a legal market, you can hypothecate it to the health system. We also don't have health data because people aren't reporting because there's still the stigma associated with it, which is another reason why we should decriminalise. Decriminalise throughout the country, all the states and territories, immediately, so we can get rid of the stigma so that people feel that they can report to health data experts on their experiences and what happened. And then we can divert all of that wasted resource on cannabis policing into family violence, and we can move to a harm minimisation approach. So I guess the key point I want to leave you with is that is that it's common, and it's been common in the United States. In the United States, for medicinal cannabis to happen first. That's a feature of the US history of decriminalisation and legalisation. So we start with medicinal. And then you move towards legalisation by starting with decriminalisation. So in a federal system like Australia, the ACT has homegrown. There have been some very good quality scientific studies of the impact of the ACT model, and that allows politicians, parliamentarians from other states and territories in Australia to invoke the ACT model and say, hey, it's working here, the sky hasn't fallen in, it isn't a big deal, let's do it here, etc., etc. And of course, that's that's what's been animating the Victorian reforms that were recently introduced by the legalised cannabis party there, and also supported by the Greens. Other people have spoken about RDT, so I won't address that. There are a lot of different legalisation models that we could think about in Australia. Of course, the United States has gone the retail shop model. Why would we expect anything else from the United States? You know, over there, everything is mercantile and commercial, and it's about the dollar. They take that approach. The Germans, perhaps characteristically, have taken a cannabis club or cooperative model. So you could have a cooperative of all of the people in this room. We could all pool our resources, and then we could pay for a cooperative to buy a farm that produces a particular type of cannabis that we all like, and then we would share in that. And then if the government wants to share health messages with us, they could do that through the cooperative model. And cooperatives, of course, work in Australian industry. When you buy milk, it's usually from a cooperative that brings together dairy farmers into a viable economic model. And then there's the countries that have had small boutique approaches. So some parts, Canada has legalised nationally, but there are a lot of boutique growers in that country. Small-scale licences in New Mexico, they have a lot of small-scale licence growers, so people who've got plantations of 500 plants or less, and they develop specific strains that people like, and then they market those. And I've been visiting a dispensary in Gallup, New Mexico, every time I go to the States, which is every year, and watching their business grow and develop. Notably, some introduction of some franchising effects in that country, which I mentioned before. In the United States, as soon as anything makes money, the franchisers move in and tend to, squeeze out all the innovation. But that's just an American thing, I think. And of course, amnesties. There's a lot of we need to have criminal justice amnesties. So it gets, the injustices of cannabis possession offences are not just in front of us; they're behind us. So many people have had their lives ruined by the way the criminal justice system addresses possession offences, and there are a lot of effects that we haven't incidentally talked about yet this morning, and I'll just mention a few of them. You'd all be aware of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which started about 10 years ago, and recent political reforms to aged care. There's a lot of really valuable work that disability workers and aged care workers do in the community, but unfortunately there's also a lot of state regulatory measures that say you can't be a disability worker, you can't be an aged care worker if you've got a criminal conviction. And that, I can't tell you how many cases end up on my desk from people who are being deprived of the opportunity to work in that sector. I did get a hand raised up in the back there. So it's common for these very heavy-handed enforcement-style regulatory systems to stop people from working in areas where they've got wonderful skills that they could share, and who take real joy and pride in that work and who would do a wonderful job. But it's this cannabis possession beatdown that happens again and again and again, and those convictions, it's the convictions that damage the lives, really. So I guess the final point I'd make is all the pushback factors that we expect in Australian politics. Wowserism, that's a big feature of the Australian culture, which they don't have so much in the United States, it has to be said. The conservatism of the media, how quickly I mean, we need to educate journalists as much as we need to educate politicians. Questionable think tanks that occupy way too much public attention. I was recently in at the federal parliamentary inquiry into cannabis about a year ago, and there were people there from a think tank who didn't have any scientific qualifications, didn't have any legal qualifications, but were espousing information as if they were knowledgeable in those fields, right? And I think one of the wonderful things that Michael White does is really drill down on the science and make sure that the people who are using that science are not abusing the science, are not misusing the science to misinform people. And of course the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is you don't know what you don't know, but there are a lot of people who say, well, I've done my research online and so I know what I know. No, you don't. So it's important to have experts involved in the discussions. Unwarranted fears of further decriminalisation. So some of you would have been seeing the messages in the media. The Advance group, the right-wing group who've been pummelling us with ads on our socials over the last few weeks saying, oh, the Greens, they want to decriminalise hard drugs and, that sort of thing. We're talking about cannabis here, okay? So focus on cannabis. That's where we should be having the discussion. The powerful alcohol industry in this country, ally or enemy? Something that needs to be considered in the decriminalisation, legalisation discussion. The law and order agenda, Dr. White was reflecting on that this morning. And finally, the main reason things don't happen in Australia, CBA. In other words, politicians can't be asked, right? So at the federal level, the state level, red and blue teams, why aren't they changing things? David Shoebridge was saying, I can't tell you how many politicians have come up to him and said, I agree with you. Yeah, no, I definitely think we should decriminalise cannabis. I definitely think we should legalise it. But then they don't do it. So continued political pressure, continued political activism. And if I might, can I congratulate the people who created this event 33 years ago and have been running it for the last 33 years for that political activism. So well done, all of you. And I'll stop and take questions if there are any questions.
Yes, please put up your hand if you have a question and we'll bring over the microphone. So, David, like 10 years ago we had some speakers come from Colorado, all fresh and excited because I think 2012 was when the state voted, or the people of the state voted, to bring in legal recreational, and I think in 2014 was when they started rolling out businesses. So yeah, that was very exciting actually to see all the different types of businesses that appeared. So the people that came and spoke were from a tourist business. So it's interesting that 10 years down the track, everything's still fine in Colorado.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important just making an observation about your comment, Kathleen. Colorado really got the first mover advantage in the United States because they were the first to legalise in the way that they did, and that meant that inbound tourism really boomed during that period. And I mean, as you say, the sky hasn't fallen in Colorado. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah. And yeah, definitely they had trouble with, for instance, not being able to access banking facilities. So yeah, just carrying around bags full of cash. It was just cash everywhere. Like you'd go into their cupboards and the cash would be in the pockets of their suits and things like that as well. So, but it was a serious trouble running quite a hefty business, and you had to pay staff, and so it was just all this cash being handed around. It was pretty wild. The
recent measures have sort of changed that a little bit, but but it's still, again, it's a problem with federalism, is if you've got one level of government regulating one thing and one regulating another, you get these weird anomalies. Gough Whitlam once described the Australian Constitution as, he said, we're riding into the 20th century on a penny farthing bicycle. Constitutional reform is as we can see with the voice referendum, is incredibly difficult in this country. The conservatism of people in this country, I don't know, so I'm going to vote no. That kind of attitude in Australia is really common and really retrograde. But I think we're going to have to work inside the constitutional system that we have, and it's really going to be about the tax revenue. And I think it's important that we don't have a situation when legalisation happens, because I believe that it will, that we don't have a situation where it's taxed as if it's a vice, right? Because if you think about the volume of tax that's imposed on alcohol and cigarettes, right? Big taxes. And I understand that there's science behind, you tax cigarettes at a high rate because then people smoke less. I'm not disputing that proposition. But I'm hopeful that we can start having a bit more of a sensible understanding and a sensible conversation in this country about where tax revenue comes from. Because tax revenue is coming from all of you, and it's not coming from Gina Reinhart, and it's not coming from billionaires, it's not coming from multimillionaires, it's coming from property speculators. It's not coming from them. It's coming from, our tax system needs fundamental reform, and my fear is that when legalisation happens, that state governments, federal government are going to see it as a way to gouge more taxation revenue out of people without getting the right balance. And in fairness to the United States, they seem to have gotten the balance right on the tax front in a lot of states and territories. So, and I think there's a fundamental difference. In this country, and perhaps it's an artefact of compulsory voting, we expect governments to collect revenue and provide services. That's what we expect in Australia. And the public health system is an example of that. I know it's not perfect, but I grew up in California. I remember playing frisbee golf when I was 15 in California, and I got injured, and I had to be driven right across Los Angeles, 2 hours in the back of the car. I was in absolute agony to get to the doctor that was paid for by my chemistry professor father's private health insurance, right? So that's their system. It's a terrible system. So they see health as something you pay for if you can afford it, right? Whereas we have a strong belief in public health. Why is that important to this discussion? Because we expect our politicians to develop systems that provide services for us, whereas in America they don't expect that. The main thing that American politicians do is get lobbying people from business to tell them what to put in the legislation, right? It's an oligarchy. America is run by billionaires. Its legislatures are run by money, right? Elections are this distraction that happen every so often. I'm not saying it's entirely like that, but it's mostly like that. So the consequence of that is the taxes are low on this new business venture, which is cannabis. So it's kind of interesting comparing the two countries and their cultures. What we need to do here, though, when we get to legalisation and we're thinking about taxation, we don't want to tax cannabis so much that people don't feel as if they can use the legalised and therefore regulated product, which has certain properties, because the whole point you buy a product is what's on the tin, right? You know how it's going to affect you. And for those of you who've travelled in the United States, you walk into a dispensary, there's a board behind the counter, they'll tell you how much THC is in it, they'll tell you whether it's sativa, indica, blends, and you can find out what makes sense for you, and then you can keep on going with that, and you may decide that if Southern Comfort was your first drink, that it's not going to be the only thing you ever drink in your life. But I'm concerned that when we move to legalisation, that we won't get the tax right, and maybe in 10 years' time I'll be proven right or wrong. But yeah.
I'll just come with the mic.
You mentioned earlier that we really need to get federal Australian government and state government sort of working together. Does that mean that we kind of have to have them all passing legislation at the same time, which seems to me to be close to impossible? Or could we, for example, get the federal government to pass something first and then get various states to come along when each state is ready?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. That's a really good one. Look, ideally it would be everybody at once, but if that can't be achieved for whatever reason, then what you could do is, just in the same way that the federal government passed medicinal cannabis legislation in 2016, which carved out an exception out of the single convention, out of the Narcotic Drugs Act of 1967, the federal legislation, you could carve out a second exception, and you could do what the Canadians have done in their Cannabis Act, which is they've said, well, if you read the single convention, it says that we should avoid illicit cannabis, right? Okay, so if you interpret that as we are going to legalise, decriminalise and legalise, so then the illicit cannabis is something else, right? Okay, so it's a way of interpreting that suite of provisions in a single convention. So ideally, federal legislation would carve out a space that states or territories could then walk into. And that would be the way of achieving, what you just described before. Yeah.
Great. Do have any more questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Patrick, for coming and sharing. Very kind. Maybe we'll get you to come back to MardiGrass again. You might notice that our speakers keep coming back over and over. So
thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.